So, here we are again with the High Middle Ages this time, and we're gonna talk you about the development of the church um, assets during the say the disgregation of Carolingian power. And in generally the enlargement of ecclesiastical assets through different processes that took place at the time. One, in fact, may wonder why bishops or other clergymen became so powerful, especially during the during the late Carolingians and eventually in the following centuries. Obviously, yeah, bishops were powerful already before, but during the High Middle Ages, basically, these figures become powerful as much, if not even more, um, than laymen, princes, and lords. And we can say that uh, the the stabilization of these ecclesiastical estates was in fact already granted, as I said before, um, before the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, and during the same Carolingian Empire itself, indeed, many um, bishops and abbots received certain holdings from the kings themselves, so that we talk about bishop counts, in the sense that certain bishops or other clergymen were given the same were conferred the same duties and properties that were normally given by Carolingian kings to laymen that became counts. And that was quite important for the Carolingian Empire, because it was not only useful because obviously it engaged the church into the government of the empire, but also because additionally the church was a fixed entity, meaning that if you gave the land to a vassal, yeah, theoretically the land was yours, but in practice this guy could do whatever he liked. Churchmen could do the same, theoretically, but at least they were the church, and you could speak with the church. The church had interest to be defended by the king and to obtain these properties in management. But especially clergymen, at large, at least generally speaking, were not supposed to have legitimate sons by this time. Telling you the truth, it's not really like this, meaning that by this age it was normal for bishops to have children. But at least theoretically there was no rule like in the lay world, that was, in the case of the Carolingian Empire, a mostly Germanic world from a juridical point of view, that considered the goods of a father immediately property of the sons, who therefore, even in the case of royal concessions, tended to see those properties as their own. The church really didn't work like that, and especially you could put, when a bishop died, for instance, a bishop who was named by you, who was loyal to you, and that had ties with the crown that maybe were quite more important to him than trying, at least initially, to try to make those royal goods one of the bishopric, let's say bishop after bishop, and therefore Church did assure some more stability in the concession of these assets by the king to manage. And there are many processes why, during the late Carolingian Empire, the churches became so powerful. First of all, you have to think that the Carolingian world pushed for an ecclesiastical reform that had to substantially make the Franks in the Carolingian dominions as a whole more really Christian. We know that obviously the Franks were Christians by name, at least since the 6th century. They, unlikely different other Germanic peoples, they had not been Arians at the beginning, so they passed from paganism directly to Catholicism. So they were quite faithful to the Church of Rome for many reasons, and even before the Carolingians arrived, the Merovingians had some sort of ambition that saw the Church of Rome as, in a way, a sort of a point of reference. It shouldn't be stressed very much, but it was already something like that, because they had an imperial ideology, quite simply, while other Germanic nations either didn't have the time to develop one, or maybe they had a more regional and nationally based orientation, so not trying to rebuild the universalistic ensemble of the Church of Rome and the Empire, namely Roman Empire. But when the Carolingians came, the Franks were still largely uncertainly Christian, meaning that they weren't uncertain about the fact that they were Christian formally, but the beliefs and even the knowledge of the same scriptures was extremely low. Many of these guys didn't even understand Latin properly, and they misunderstood what was written in the Bible, and even during the Mass, they couldn't really say the exact Christian formula in Latin. So the Carolingians decided that in order to be the renewed Roman Empire, they also had to have a church worthy of this name, with clergymen that were fit to their role and who were commensurate to the greatness of the Roman Empire. And after this wave of Christianization, of reconfirmation of Christian identity and education and so on, there was consequently an increase of donations to the church from the laymen. This really didn't happen just because of pious religious sentiments. It was also related to the fact that many Carolingian counts saw quite interestingly the opportunity of conferring goods to the church and to private churches that they founded themselves, and maybe where they had put part of their cadets like as bishops or abbots. Think of all the monasteries that are built this time that were mostly private. And the advantage of this is that obviously ecclesiastical goods had a certain had certain rights. There was a sort of security in this investment in a way. And it wasn't surely anything new, because since the 4th century, when the Roman Empire had become Christian and other Germanic peoples had converted first to Arianism or to Catholicism, these donations had always been there. But in a certain sense, that system hadn't held perfectly, because if you see, the same Carolingian world actually rose to power by confiscating ecclesiastical goods initially. These goods were actually not ecclesiastical in the sense that they had been ecclesiastical by rights, just by donations. But let's say that especially in the periphery of the Frankish kingdom during Merovingian times, and especially in those areas that were more Romanized and where the church had a more stable asset, especially gravitating around the cities, so think about southern France, for instance. Well, in these places the church had become a sort of lordship. The various bishops had gained a lot of goods that theoretically belonged to public authority. So the Merovingian kings, but since the Merovingian kings had been busy at killing each other and fighting each other for centuries, and they hadn't managed to re-extend Frankish authority on those lands since the time of Clovis most of the times, these clergymen had taken the chance to, rule at their place. So when Charles Martel rebuilt Frankish power, turning the Frankish kingdom in the Carolingian Empire de facto, or returning it in an empire, many of these goods that belonged to the clergy were retaken back by public authority formally. And much of these lands were actually given in turn to the military aristocracy that the Carolingians had under their command, and that was of use for reconquering the lost territories. These still happened in conditions in which the Carolingians in turn founded other ecclesiastical goods, like ecclesiastical properties such as monasteries and abbeys, but it wasn't a univocal direction, and we can say that by large the ecclesiastical lands had been sort of retaken back by public authority. And what happened when the Carolingian Empire entered in crisis was that the Carolingians pushed very strongly for the inalienability of the ecclesiastical properties, for the reason that I was talking about before, that ecclesiastical lands were much more easily controllable, paradoxically, by the king and the royal authority than other lay properties. A bit because the bishops and abbots could be could change, and there wasn't really a direct lineage that was pushing for the succession to the full property in practice of the goods that had been given by the kings to that family, and that could therefore be used as a powerful ally of king of the king. Also, cause in spite ecclesiastical aristocracies, even in the Carolingian Empire, we have seen were substantially warlike. They hadn't lost the warrior character of the families from which they had came from, and possibly during Carolingian times, ecclesiastical elites had been even had seen even an increase of their level of militarization, but they were still weaker at this time compared to the lay powers, such as the ones of the counts or the various kings in which that ruled the Carolingian Empire once that it was split. So it was it was an interest from the ecclesiastical side to be faithful to the king in a certain measure, because royal power and ecclesiastical power could support each other against the lay rebels and other entities that were fighting against them at the time, and for this reason the kings ordered to the managers, let's say, of ecclesiastical goods to write periodically the so-called polyptychs, that were documents, especially written in monasteries, but not just in there, in which there had to be written essentially of what goods those properties actually consisted in, and how these goods were being managed and kept safe. And these politics are an extremely precious source for us, because it tells us in an otherwise very meager time in terms of sources and understanding of certain mechanisms, how the great assets of the church worked at the time. And this explains, even what happened in other times in history, in later Middle Ages, after these centuries of Carolingian disgregation. It explains why, where, for instance, the royal authority grew weaker and weaker, such as in France, and partially even in Germany, even if in very different ways. Let's say the ecclesiastics, the clergymen gained so much power. Think about how France, the Kingdom of France, was built during the low Middle Ages, receiving the support of the church against other vassals of the French king. The whole thing started basically in here. the Western Frankish kings had always a very strong relationship with the church and with the clergymen, bishops and abbots that lived close to Paris, because those were their first allies against an aristocracy that in the rest of the kingdom was largely rival to the royal power. Even in Germany, where paradoxically the legacy of the Carolingian royalty and empiredom, let's say, actually survived more than France itself. There was never like a very strong royal dynasty, and churches in Germany had a great power. Bishops in the low Middle Ages, German bishops were extremely powerful temporal lords. They had huge armies, and incidentally they were more tied to the royal faith in all this than the other German princes, because the king, in a way, as a public authority, did recognize their rights, and they had obviously all the interest to support a king who did such a thing. And when the German emperors went fighting below the Alps, the normal lay princes didn't want to follow them, while the bishops usually sent their contingents, and many of the German expeditions into Italy were feasible thanks to the ecclesiastical loyalty. And it all began here. Begins for the reasons that we have seen, but mostly because of the peculiar nature of the ecclesiastical goods that were preserved and protected and defended by the kings, that in turn received an ecclesiastical support, and which were properties in which royal power could play also for making other families faithful to the crown, entering in certain prestigious positions, such as the ones of bishops and abbots. Actually had rows, and we will see that in another moment. So this was all for today. Thanks for listening.